Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Hello. Well, I welcome everybody to our FFE presentations, our Franciscans for Earth presentation of Belden Lane's talk. I'd like to recognize, I think everybody already recognized that Maurice and Regina are on tonight. So we welcome them from Texas, and we're glad that they're going to be with us today. I did not notice, but Jack Zimmerman is supposed to be on with us tonight, and he also was part of our Franciscans for Earth coordinator at the farm when we had our property down in DeSoto. So I haven't seen that he's here yet, but he might be getting on too. We will start with a prayer in a moment. I would ask that everybody would mute themselves. At the end.
I did that already. She's with it.
I've been on a lot of Zoom.
That's what we always have to do.
There's somebody still not.
Background sounds.
The person running the meeting can mute everybody.
I think they can.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't find that person now. Oh, there's Jack.
Hey, y'all.
Hi, Jack.
Good to see you there.
Good to see y'all.
Mm-hmm.
You too, Jack. So we'll start with a prayer. I'll introduce Belden. Belden will screen share his PowerPoint and go through his presentation. During the presentation, we do ask that everybody stay muted. If you have any questions that you want Belden to answer at the end, please put them in the chat, and then I will feed the questions to Belden after the presentation. We'll take about 15 minutes of questions then, and then Belden's going to come back and give us an exercise, a homework. So please stay on the whole time so that you get your homework.
Time, use of the medication, and what's the role of the family or other support system.
Okay, we've got somebody here. See if I can mute that one. There, okay. And then after that giving of the homework, I'll end up with a couple of ending remarks. And that will be our whole evening. So let's start with a prayer. And the prayer comes from Mary Oliver's When I Am Among the Trees. Oops, I forgot to share sound and optimize. Okay, we'll get it right yet.
When I am among the trees, especially the willows and the honey locust, equally the beech, the oaks and the pines, they give off such hints of gladness. I would almost say that they save me, and daily I am so distant from the hope of myself, in which I have goodness and discernment, and never hurry through the world, but walk slowly and bow often. Around me the trees stare in their leaves and call out, "Stay a while." The light flows from their branches and they call again. "It's simple," they say. And you too have come into the world to do the same, to go easy, to be filled with light and to shine.
Before I introduce Belden, I want to also recognize all the Franciscan sisters that are on tonight. Because we are so many, you won't be able to see them all. If they want to put a heart up, then those that are on their screen can see who of us are the Franciscan sisters. Okay. Thank you, sisters. So Belden Lane is a professor of theological studies at St. Louis University. He is a storyteller, a lover of the wilderness and wilderness backpacking. His books include The Solace of Fierce Landscapes, Exploring Desert and Mountain Spirituality, Backpacking with the Saints, Wilderness Hiking as a Spiritual Practice, and The Great Conversation, Nature and the Care of the Soul. So tonight, Belden is going to talk on listening to the trees, renewing Thomas Berry's Great Conversation. For more than 25 years, Belden had a practice of praying with a 100-year-old cottonwood tree in the park across the street from his house, and he calls this tree grandfather. So this relationship was very important to Belden. And tonight, he's going to talk to us about the trees and our relationship that should be with the trees and Thomas Berry's Great Conversation. So Belden, it's all yours. You can screen share. Go.
Okay, thank you, Cheryl. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, I want to share some thoughts tonight about listening and talking to trees as a spiritual practice. And I need to begin with a story. Once upon a time, there was a Hasidic Rebbe whose young son began leaving the synagogue each morning during his daily prayers. He went to wander out in the woods. The boy loved being alone in the forest. Now, the father was concerned, not just because the boy was neglecting his prayers, but because the woods were wild and dangerous there in the Carpathian Mountains where they lived. So he asked his son one day, "Why do you go out there alone in the forest? I noticed you've been doing it a lot lately." The boy replied, "I go into the woods to find God." "Ah, that's wonderful," said his dad. "I'm glad you're searching for God, but you know, you don't have to go anywhere
We're not hearing
special.
Belden, is anyone?
You don't need to go anywhere special to find the Holy One, blessed be his name. God is the same everywhere," the father said. "Yes," the boy answered, "but I'm not. God may be the same everywhere, but I'm not." The boy knew there was something different about him when he was out in the wilds, out among the tall, dark trees. He was more receptive and open when he was there, more vulnerable. He knew the trees were able to take him outside of himself and into the presence of God. Now, 6 years ago, Pope Francis, in his encyclical on ecology, called us to this same kind of awareness. He summoned us to recognize the larger family of which we are members. Laudato Si says we need to begin listening to the others who belong to the same household as ours, including trees, animals, oceans, and stars, because they make us more available to God himself. Now, all this is close to my heart because my last book, as Cheryl shared, was entitled The Great Conversation, Nature and the Care of the Soul. It's about our learning to connect with the larger community of which we're part, and trees in particular. Thomas Berry said that we as humans have dropped out of the great conversation. We've lost our ability to converse with the rest of the natural world. We're talking only to ourselves, he complained. We're not talking to the rivers. We aren't listening to the wind and stars. We've broken the great conversation. And that's a tremendous loss, one that signals our spiritual poverty and allows us to destroy a world we once held in reverence. We don't have a language anymore for what once energized our myths and fired our imagination. We've lost the connection that we once shared with the standing ones, the great trees. William Blake once said, "The tree that moves some to tears of joy is in the eyes of others only a green thing that stands in the way." Today, we suspect that people who are brought to tears by trees must have been reading too much Tolkien. They still believe in fairy tales. But we make a huge mistake when we try to separate the sacred character of human life from all the rest of the natural world, as if it were simply a backdrop and window dressing for our lives. That's a highly dualistic way of thinking that cuts against the biblical tradition itself. In the Bible, creation is a seamless whole, all of it sacred, coming from the very hand of God. You can't pull out one part to the exclusion of everything else without doing damage to the whole system. How many times in Genesis 1 does God say, "It's good, I like it," all that God keeps making? Trees, especially the old ones, are crucial for us, not simply because they provide timber, a carbon sink, and oxygen in support of human life. They witness to something holy in their own majestic beauty, in the way the wind moves them, and the way they nurture each other within a forest setting. The tree in mythical traditions around the world is the axis mundi, a sacred center connecting the underworld below and the heavens above. Trees in scripture are frequently connected with significant moments in the spiritual life. You think of Abraham and Sarah camped under an oak tree at Mamre when they received the promise of a child, new life breaking into their world. The renowned cedars of Lebanon, planted by God's own hand, says Psalm 104, were used to build the first temple. The exiled children of Israel wrestle with desolation as they hang their harps on the willows of Babylon. And Nathanael is standing under a fig tree when Jesus first sees and calls him. When we tell stories of breakthrough in the spiritual life, we not uncommonly remember trees. The Bible, after all, begins with the tree of life and ends with the tree of paradise in the New Jerusalem. Its leaves meant for the healing of nations. A forest full of trees, said Carl Jung, is nothing less than a magical place. Now, my own most important teacher in all of this is a 100-year-old Eastern cottonwood tree who lives in an urban park across the street from my house. The Swedish botanist Linnaeus named him Populus deltoides. I call him grandfather. I've learned to love this tree. He's a member of the poplar family. His leaves flutter like aspen trees in the lightest breeze. The Lakota people say that cottonwood trees are sacred. They pray as their leaves move in the wind. Now, grandfather is a male of his species, producing flowery red catkins each spring full of pollen. And the wind carries the pollen to the green catkins of female cottonwood trees nearby. When pollinated, these produce capsules of tiny seeds attached to cottony parachutes that fill the air in late May and early June. I was out walking with grandfather over by him yesterday, and the female trees are already starting to cotton. For some 20 years, I've entrusted this tree with the care of my soul. In the last decade, we've assumed a more formal apprenticeship, exploring deeper ways of communicating with each other. What that means is that we're increasingly falling in love. Communication, in the end, is nothing more than learning to love, letting the soft animal of your body love what it loves, as Mary Oliver says. Grandfather and I met some 30 years ago now at a time of mutual crisis. My mother was in a nursing home dying of cancer with Alzheimer's disease. He was dealing with a lightning strike and fierce windstorm that had just blown down one of the two great trunks growing up from his roots. A 12-foot high wound was left in his side. That's what first drew me to him. A common hurt opened the door between us. Isn't that interesting? Now, grandfather is old for his species. Eastern cottonwoods don't live much beyond 100 years. But this tree is still very much alive. He stands almost 100 feet tall. I call him grandfather largely because of his size, but also for what he has to teach me. We spend time together every night as I go over to lean into his hollow and pray. In the last 5 years, I've become a grandfather myself, and I've delighted in taking our granddaughter, Ellie, over to see him as well, inviting her to love him too. Here we are in the cave of grandfather's side, Ellie and Babu. His wounded place is just the right size for the two of us. We fit together, a little girl, an old man, and a still older tree. And because of my relationship to this tree through the years, my perception of everything else has begun to change. I'm made open to a world where I expect other things to be fully alive as well. I'm looking for relationship where I hadn't expected it before. And for me, that's a huge step forward in spiritual growth. Now, little Ellie's connection with grandfather has been especially intriguing to me. And it began even before she was born. Nearly 6 years ago, my wife and I were ecstatic about learning our first grandchild was coming. We didn't know yet whether it would be a boy or a girl. But I had a dream one night at the time, and in the dream, I was over at the park, standing in front of the hollow in grandfather's side. And a little girl came right out of the tree. She was lit like the sun, wearing a shining white dress, almost angelic with blonde hair and blue eyes. And somehow I knew she was my granddaughter, not even born yet. In my dream, she asked me if I wanted to go back into the tree with her. She said it wasn't scary and there was room for both of us. She took my hand and we walked into the tree's hollow and on into the very heartwood of the tree, going up into its dark interior together, moving higher and higher. And as we finally reached the inside tips of the topmost branches, I woke up feeling euphoric. You see, for years, I'd been spending time with this tree, researching and writing about him. But this was the first time I'd been able to go inside the tree, meeting him in a much more intimate way, entering into the very heart of the tree and its mystery. It's what I'd always longed for. A granddaughter, not yet even born, had come to me out of the womb of the tree, if you will, inviting me back inside with her. 2 months later, My wife Patricia and I were in the waiting room of the maternity ward at St. Mary's Hospital as our son brought our new grandchild out. It was a stunning little girl with blonde hair and blue eyes, one I was seeing for the second time, seeing her through my tears. Even today, when Ellie and I walk over to the park to go to the playground, we'll pass by the tree and she'll sometimes say, "Babu, there's grandfather. That's where I came from." This is one of the most sacred experiences of my life. This story of experiencing God, as it were, coming to me in a tiny little girl and a wounded tree. Now let's pause for a moment. I'd like to invite you to take a deep breath and to think about the trees you may have known in your life. Trees you may have climbed as a child, trees you may have gone to for comfort in times of grief, trees that filled you with awe as you were walking through a forest you knew was full of mystery. What are the trees, maybe one tree in particular, that has drawn you more deeply into yourself and even into the presence of God? And is it time maybe for you to reconnect with one of those trees, or to find a new tree teacher as a companion in your spiritual life? Think about this, and I'll offer, as Cheryl said, an exercise in doing this near the end. But think about it as you listen to this poem from Wendell Berry. It's titled, "I Go Among Trees," from his book, Sabbaths. I go among trees and sit still. All my stirring becomes quiet around me, like circles on water. My tasks lie in their places where I left them, asleep like cattle. Then what is afraid of me comes and lives a while in my sight. What it fears in me leaves me, and the fear of me leaves it. It sings, and I hear its song. Then what I am afraid of comes. I live for a while in its sight. What I fear in it leaves it, and the fear of it leaves me. It sings, and I hear its song. After days of labor, mute in my consternations, I hear my song at last, and I sing it. As we sing, the day turns, the trees move. As we sing, the day turns, the tree moves. I Go Among Trees by Wendell Berry. Trees can be so good at helping us to let go of all that frightens and to recover the songs we most need to sing. Now we're learning a lot more today about how trees communicate, how they sing and relate to each other. As a result of new research in tree biology, science writers like Michael Pollan tell us that older trees share nutrients with younger ones through an underground root system. Trees are great teachers of mutual relationship and vulnerability. They give themselves to each other and to us in so many different ways. I'm more and more convinced that our communication with each other and with the more than human world has to be rooted in a shared vulnerability. It's only as we recognize our need for each other, sharing common hurts and disclosing what we long for most, that we deeply touch each other, having nothing to hide. I hope we're slowly learning this today with respect to all of the others around us, learning it racially, politically, ecologically. Grandfather reaches out to me again and again in his vulnerability. The two of us live in a St. Louis neighborhood, University City, that is generally safe, but like many city parks, this one has its share of rowdy beer drinkers at times, some furtive drug dealing, and even occasional gunshots being fired. You learn to be careful. 3 years ago, a raucous bunch of partiers set a fire in Grandfather's cavity. It was put out, but his bark is scorched black on that side 20 feet up, as you can see. He's given me plenty to worry about through the years. In winter storms, I've watched a 1/4-inch layer of ice weighing down his branches. I've stood inside him while 60-mile-an-hour gusts of wind twisted his frame like tensile steel. One night, after a 12-inch snowfall, the temperature dropped to almost 20 degrees below zero. Having heard of trees exploding as their sap freezes, I feared for him. But Grandfather is a survivor. He's weathered the threats of wind, fire, lightning, and ice that bring terror to creatures of the wood. I had a chance several years ago to climb and sleep in a hammock in the top of this wonderful tree. I got permission from the City Parks Department and worked with a tree climbing teacher here in town. It was one of the great experiences of my life, being held in the arms of a tree on a moonlit spring night overlooking the neighborhood we both love. The two of us, after all, share a history of deep time. My ancestors and yours climbed, worked, and lived among the branches of his ancestors for thousands and thousands of years. For most people passing through the park, this is an old tree past its prime, scarred by fire, rotting from the inside out, soon to be marked with a large red X by the park's forestry crew. But for me, he's a presence in my life that's hard to describe. Old trees can be a doorway into mystery. Martin Buber, in his book, I and Thou, spoke of two different ways of relating to a tree. On the one hand, he said, I can assign it to a species and observe it as an object, but it can also happen, he said, if will and grace are joined, that as I contemplate the tree, I'm drawn into a relationship and the tree ceases to be an it. Buber and his tree were able to enter into a deep mystery of reciprocity of their own. Grandfather and I do the same, communicating in a nonverbal, sensuous way. When I press my hand over the deep furrows of his bark, he doesn't move, not in the way that a horse's flank will shiver on being touched. Trees do nothing in a hurry. But as I touch the tree, I imagine being touched by him in return. I delight in his smell, pressing my nose each night into the shallow cave of his wounded place. It's the musty smell of old furniture, cinnamon bark, and wood smoke. It reminds me of my dad's putting me to bed when I was a child at night, remembering his smell of stale cigarette smoke and Old Spice aftershave. When I go over to Grandfather every evening, I give myself to the reverie that trees invite. And within that contemplative state, I may sense a subtle shift in consciousness, a thought or feeling that arises within me and yet seems to be more than me. It's nothing I can verify. The mystery of our entire relationship is that nothing happens as such. I hear no voices. We share no identifiable language, and yet we connect. It's so much like my relationship with God, after all. Now, what fascinates me in our time is that the standing ones, the trees, are cropping up in every part of our culture today, reaching out to us in our dreams, inviting us to marvel at their grace, stunning us with reports from the frontiers of forest biology. Accounts of the intelligence and communicative power of trees abound in scholarly journals today and best-selling books like Peter Wohleben's The Hidden Lives of Trees. People are fascinated by those who climb sequoias, 300 feet tall, huge trees. Fascinated by the charm of living in tree houses, by the Japanese practice of forest bathing, finding it restorative to sit quietly among old cedar trees. Actress Judi Dench, in a recent BBC documentary on her passion for trees, is simply smitten by her love for these leafy creatures. And the green movement is alive and well, feeding on the memory of Julia Butterfly Hill protesting in the top of a redwood tree. Tree Sisters, a global network of women committed to reforestation, aims at planting 1 billion trees over the next 10 years, knowing that we've already lost 80% of our old growth forests. The explosion of deforestation in our time is making us pay attention as never before to what we're now losing. 340,000 acres in the Amazon rainforest since the beginning of this year, for example. Lord help us. And yet, something is happening today. Trees are coming to life in our imagination. From the Ent trees in The Lord of the Rings, to the Tree of Souls in the movie Avatar, to Richard Powers' stunning new novel, The Overstory. Gandalf, the wizard, predicted what we're seeing in our day. A thing is about to happen that hasn't happened since the elder days, he said. The Ents are going to wake up and find that they are strong. Trees today are rediscovering their voice in us. May it be so. May it be so. You see, for thousands of years, people knew that trees could talk, having so much to teach us. And the standing ones today are calling us back to that forgotten language. In the 12th century, Hildegard of Bingen perceived an unknown language and unheard music, she said, coming from trees and shrubs. She composed a secret alphabet for this hidden language, providing new names for over 800 plants, allowing her to speak to and for them. She was a gifted herbalist, fascinated by the healing power of everything green. The history of myth is rich in stories of people conversing with trees. The Baal Shem Tov, 18th century founder of the modern Hasidic movement, is said to have spoken 26 different languages, not just Hebrew, Yiddish, and Polish. He knew the tongues of birds, trees, animals, plants, and clouds as well. And Francis of Assisi, of course, loved preaching to the birds under a great oak tree at his hermitage on Mount Sabasio. Today, a huge shift in consciousness is underway. A sea change from an I and it marketplace conception of the world to an I and thou sense of communal identity. Joanna Macy describes it as a great turning, an ecological revolution, widening our awareness of the intricate web that connects us all. Teilhard de Chardin, the great Jesuit, called it an evolution of consciousness, emerging now, a sense of the planetization, he called it, of humankind. And we see it in Pope Francis's plea for a massive new dialogue about how we are shaping the future of our planet. We need to think now like an earth community, not like separate individuals. The trees themselves are demanding it of us. Their old ones are calling to our old ones. In particular, I can feel it in my bones. Now, as I said, there's an astounding new tree science that demonstrates how trees are intrinsically social beings. They reach out to each other across generations and species. This is forest biologist Suzanne Simard. She's head of the Mother Tree Project at the University of British Columbia. She explores the vast information superhighway that constitutes the underground world of a forest. There are mycorrhizal fungi that connect the roots of all the neighboring trees. They operate like fiber optic cables to transmit information, allowing trees to communicate with each other. That's how they share what's needed to keep the community alive. Extending beyond the root hairs, these fungi enhance the tree's capacity to absorb water, nitrogen, and phosphorus. They allow older trees to share nutrients with younger ones and even with other tree species as needed. Through this wood wide web, mother hub trees reach out to nurture a deeply interrelated community. It's as if the forest operates like a super organism of its own, sensing and providing for the needs of individual trees within it. Scientists are increasingly perceiving trees as purposeful beings living in dynamic relationship with each other. Their symbiotic networks mimic human neural and social networks. A new field of plant neurobiology, if you will, analyzes the cellular tissue at the tips of roots and shoots, observing how information is processed and conducted through slow-moving electrical signals. Trees also communicate, we're told, by means of scent and taste. When threatened by insects or animals, certain trees will emit an ethylene gas to warn neighboring trees of approaching danger. They pump toxic substances into their leaves to ward off attackers and use pheromones to draw beneficial predators who can fight those attackers. Trees are amazing beings. Japanese scientists today are also analyzing the physiological effect of trees on human beings, observing how time spent in a forest reduces the stress hormone cortisol, lowering heart rate and blood pressure. Trees reach out not only to themselves, but to us in all sorts of ways, inviting humans to tune in to their stillness, to listen more carefully. The psalmist proclaims that the whole earth speaks, every creature shouting glory in its own dialect, especially the trees, singing and clapping their hands, the psalmist says again and again, giving praise to God in their tall strength and deep vulnerability. If you hang there in your tree harness, near the top of a 200-foot tree overlooking a vast Costa Rican rainforest, you'll see and hear them in all of the glory. Now, I'd like to share with you a story about how I was first introduced to this whole idea of talking with trees, renewing the great conversation. It happened 30 years ago now on a backpacking trip down in the Ozarks. My mother was 3 weeks away from her death, as it happened at the time. I needed to get away to sort things out for myself. On a March afternoon, I hiked into Lower Rock Creek. A stream there flows through a canyon cut through the rough terrain of the St. Francis Mountains, hour and a half or 2 hours south of St. Louis. A week earlier, there had been a 12-inch snowfall, followed by a thaw and heavy rain, bringing a flash flood careening down the canyon. As I walked in, I could see branches and debris caught in tree limbs high over my head. The memory of violent rushing water still lingered. Downstream, I found a place to camp, set up my tent, and built a little fire, eating supper as the sun was setting. I rarely make a fire out in the woods, but I needed the comfort of one that night. Sitting beside it, I noticed a small pine tree across the fire from me, maybe 2 feet tall. I hadn't noticed the tree before, and I said hello. I wasn't accustomed to talking to trees at the time. I've learned a lot better since then. And in the reverie evoked by the fire, I imagined the tree responding back, asking me to tell a story. You know, that's what little kids do, after all, when you're sitting around a fire. I had never told a story to a tree before, but I liked the idea, especially as a Lakota Sioux tale about death and transformation came to mind. Now, a storyteller has to adjust his narrative to his listener, of course, and there were things I had to explain to the tree that he or she might not understand. It was a challenge at first, but I sensed that we were both getting into it. Night was coming on as I picked up another handful of sticks to put on the fire, and the light blazed up as I noticed 3 or 4 other little trees gathered around the fire. I could have sworn they hadn't been there when I set up camp. I suspected they'd all snuck in to listen to the story. As a storyteller, I don't ever remember being listened to as carefully as I was that night by a handful of trees in a Missouri wilderness. I was stunned by the intensity with which I imagined them attending to the tale. Trying to understand what might explain their attentiveness, I realized, for one thing, that they had never heard a story before. Very few people wander into this remote stretch of wilderness, mostly hunters and backpackers, people who aren't accustomed to telling stories to trees. So this was a novelty for them. I also realized that the trees knew what I was talking about as they listened to a tale about death and transformation. They had just survived a flash flood sweeping over them a week earlier. Amazingly, they hadn't been uprooted. Moreover, they were surrounded by death, growing out of the rotted remains of grandfathers and grandmothers before them. Yet I knew there was something still more about the fascination that drew them to the story. At last, I caught on that they were watching the fire along with me. None of these trees had ever seen flames before. There was no indication that a forest fire had swept through the area or a campfire had been built during their lifetimes. The hair rose on the back of my neck as I realized these trees were listening to a story about their own death and transformation as they watched wood burn. Seeing the stuff of their own being transformed into flickering tongues of orange, red, and yellow, then left as a light gray ash blown away by the wind. This was my first experience of communicating with trees, learning that a forest is truly alive. The trees never spoke a word, but the exchange between us was as powerful as anything I'd known. Hearing the story as the trees heard it, I was carried more deeply into my own untapped grief at the time, given a new way of looking at my mother's dying, offered a new sense of community shared across an interspecies boundary bridged by mutual loss. Now, what I'm saying in all of this tonight is that in the present moment of our vast ecological loss, given all the threats to the environment, it is more important than ever that we connect with this wider community. The earth is at risk today, and us with it. We all are threatened by climate change, the extinction of species, and the loss of habitat, whether it's forests being burned to the ground or islands sinking into the sea. And yet, the crisis also occasions an incredible opportunity. It forces us now to think beyond species boundaries, to recognize a common fear and a common yearning for life that we share together, all of us. It makes us listen to the lament and the longing that arises from every corner of the earth, every creature. In short, it demands of us a new language, a deeper way of expressing and deepening the unity we seek. In short, it's time for us to rejoin the great conversation. May we do so. Amen. Now, as I said, I have an exercise I want to suggest for you and another short story or two. But let's stop here, Cheryl, for some questions as they may have come up in the chat. See if I can try to answer them. And I'd love to hear stories of people's own experience with trees.
Belden, I have no words for the beauty and the wonder that your words have invoked in me. It's beautiful.
Heart speaks to heart. Amen.
So far, the only thing in the chat is somebody has said, I love and collect tree pictures and have my sacred tree space at a park nearby. And then she says, I love this guy. Thank you for this experience.
Mm-hmm.
And she also says that my special tree is over a lake.
Mm-hmm. A lot of trees in Missouri, I think of sycamores, especially, they love water. And they're right on the bank of every river in our state, being washed out, the roots as the river runs by. But trees and water love each other. Cottonwoods too. A cottonwood like grandfather, I'm told, can heave a couple of 100 gallons of water a day on a hot summer day after a heavy rain. They're incredible, and their root systems reach out about twice as far as the limbs of the tree above ground. So yeah, trees and water fit together beautifully.
Let's see, somebody else has said, my favorite tree caught a disease and I am so sad. And here's another one. Just this week, I bought the book, Celtic Tree Rituals by Charlene Hidalgo. And she says, your knowledge and inspiration in tonight's conversation make me very excited to learn more about trees. Thanks for sharing your stories with us.
Celtic Tree Rituals, that's the name of the book?
Yes.
You know, I come from Celtic heritage, my family name and roots. And the Celts were amazing. The Druids, especially, they loved oak trees. They thought they were sacred above all others. In fact, the word Druid comes from seer of oaks. And they had a whole alphabet, an Ogham alphabet of, was it 22 letters? I'm trying to remember. And a different tree for each letter of the alphabet.
Wow.
So trees were incredibly important creatures in the Celtic practice of attending to the natural world, discerning wisdom, seeking direction, etc. Wonderful. I don't, if this is a new book, Celtic Tree Rituals, I don't know of it, so I'm happy to learn.
Here's a question. Can you comment on how sequoias grow?
Sequoias and redwoods are closely related. They are amazing trees with enormously thick bark that protects them from fire. the tree that Julia Butterfly Hill lived in for almost 2 years, protecting the tree from a lumber company there in Northern California. She named it Luna. And this tree, not exactly sure how old it is, but a couple of thousand years at least. And she saved the tree. So the sad thing was that the lumber company agreed, after cutting down almost all of the other redwoods around it, to save that tree. But a disgruntled logger came in about 6 months later and with a huge chainsaw made a cut almost halfway through the tree. They've anchored it with steel bolts, and it's still alive, still well. The tenacity, the determination to live among these great tall trees is utterly amazing. And the great oak trees, I think of bristlecone pines in Northern California. There's some that almost 6,000 years old, as old as the pyramids in Egypt. These great beings that have so much wisdom, so much to offer us, still with us after all these years. I don't know a great deal about the science of sequoias in particular, so I can't help that. If this questioner might know more himself, I'd love to hear.
Here's somebody's commenting on your tree and says she prays that they never cut it down. The Parks Department never cuts it down, and that they check on it often.
Yeah, I was talking to, last year, I was talking to the tree supervisor. I saw him in the park. And I said, "You're not going to touch that tree, are you?" And he said, we've had our eye on it, but the crown is good. That's one of the ways you discern the health of a tree.
Yeah.
And, you know, what a project I've been working on, this has been a tough year for me. Ellie's daddy, our son, died of cancer this last year during the coronavirus epidemic. And I had been working on a children's book. That's what I would love to yet finish in my life. A children's book about Ellie and Babu. When Ellie in the book she's about 11 or 12 years old, and she and a couple of other girlfriends, they fight to save this tree grandfather because the city is threatening to erect a monument to the logging industry in the state of Missouri, and to cut down this tree, this old ragged tree anyway, to make room for that memorial. And so the girls do everything they can to try to save the tree. So one of my hopes is that through maybe writing a children's book that might even get published, that attention would be drawn more to grandfather, and he be saved as long as possible. But we all have our time to come when we know it's time to be cut, but not yet.
Several people have shared their story of their tree. So here's one that says, "My dancing darling sits in the front of my house, a trunk twisted and swirling, reminding me to dance through the day. I will embrace her and hold her in appreciation to her presence. Any other suggestions to let her know how I treasure her presence?"
Oh, that's beautiful. The most important thing I can do is to assure her that that tree delights far more in what she gives to it than she can ever imagine. You know, after all these years spending all this time with grandfather, there's just something that happens in touching together. And as she dances with the tree, there is a connection and a caring that reaches from both sides, from one species to the other. I absolutely know that. I've experienced it. And so just to encourage her to continue that, to celebrate the tree. I will, on special feast days, maybe solstices or other things, I've done things like hammer fertilizer stakes in a circle around the tree. That's really not necessary, but it's a way of honoring grandfather. I will walk around the tree, calling in the sacred directions, honoring him in various ways. There are all kinds of tree rituals, even beyond Celtic practice, that that are helpful. But she can't do better than dance with her tree.
Here's one that says, Belden, you've given me back a beautiful memory. We had a huge willow tree at our summer cottage on Lake Michigan. My parents put our swing set underneath. It was a most magical space. I suspect my mother knew the specialness of the space in her childhood. Thank you for this recollection. I always love finding willow trees.
Oh, that's great. You know that a child's first tree is tremendously important. Richard Love, the Last Child in the Woods, his book, he laments the nature deficit disorder that is more and more a flaw or a concern among our children and us as adults too, that we have a deficit of spending time in nature, and especially with trees, and maybe most especially with a particular tree. There's a banyan tree that grew outside my bedroom window in the wood house I grew up in outside Orlando, Florida. And banyan trees, of course, are wonderful trees. They just beg to be climbed because they grow roots coming down from their limbs to anchor into the soil, and you can climb them in all kinds of ways. But to be able to go back to your childhood and to remember that tree, your first tree, and what it meant to you, climbing it and spending time in it, reading under it, that's a wonderful thing. Great.
Here's another one. Thank you, Mr. Lane. I have felt the calling back to the trees, and it speaks to me that you have referenced the Lakota a few times because we have planned a very impromptu trip to the Black Hills of South Dakota in 3 weeks. I will take your words with me as I am hiking with my family.
Yeah, the Lakota, dear friend of mine is a Lakota teacher, and they especially love cottonwood trees. Cottonwood trees because of their praying in the wind as their cottonwood leaves, the heart-shaped leaves, are connected to branches by a flat petiole, a stem that allows them to flutter in the least bit of breeze. And oh, it's a wonderful sound to sit under grandfather on a windy day and to listen to all those trees praying, as the Lakota people would say. It's a cottonwood tree, that a young cottonwood trunk that would be used in the Sundance ceremony, the most sacred of all Lakota rituals. So bless your friend as you go to the beautiful country of South Dakota. And may we all learn from our Indigenous friends to remember all our relatives.
In the time we have left, I'll just share 2 more comments that I've written here, and then we'll go on to your exercise. So here somebody says, if you've never seen it, you might like to check out the book, That Tree, an iPhone photo journal documenting a year in the life of a lonely bur oak. The author took 1 photo each day for a year of this beautiful tree in Wisconsin.
Oh, that's wonderful. I don't know of that. Bur oaks are huge trees, and the wonderful thing about them, they have these huge acorns with really furry tops. They're amazing. And to spend time with a tree every day for a year is a wonderful thing. There's an author, Haskins is his last name. He spent time with a square yard of land in, is it Tennessee? Every day he would go for time to meditate and to watch what was happening. There's nothing like watching the seasons and all that you have to learn from a single tree in all of those seasons of the year. Oh, great. That tree, I'll look that up.
And this last one I'll share. I'm amazed at the tenacity of cedar trees living for years through the rock bluffs in the Ozarks. An example for me in my life.
Yeah, some of those really old cedars are amazing. Although the younger red cedars are also something of a menace in how they tend to be invasive. But
Yeah.
Okay, thank you for all those questions and thoughts. Let me close suggesting a ritual exercise that you might use in following up on this talk. Within the next few days, if you can, I'd invite you to find a tree in the woods, in a park nearby, even in your backyard. Look for a tree, maybe especially that has been wounded in some way. It may have a broken limb, a cut in its trunk that's been healed over, a bent branch caused by some injury in the past. Look at this tree that's grown through barbed wire. And when you find this tree, walk up to it, sit down, and introduce yourself to the tree. Don't be embarrassed about talking out loud, even if other people may see you and you're afraid they're going to call the police or something. That's never happened to me. Take time together, you and the tree, asking the tree to tell you its story, her story. And listen to what comes into your imagination as you ponder the story the tree has to tell, looking at its roots, its limbs, its leaves, everything around it. What has this tree been through? And then tell the tree your story, something of your woundedness as well. You may be surprised at how much you and the tree share in common, how much grief you both bear, and how easier it becomes for you to share that together. Be surprised by what wells up within you in response to sharing with this tree. I have, in retreats I've held with men, I work with Richard Rohr's work with men, Illumin. It's a wonderful work. And in men's rites of passage and in weekend retreats I've led, I've seen grown men cry again and again in response to their experience of listening to a tree story and sharing their own. Then finally, before you leave the tree, offer your thanks and leave a gift. Maybe a stone that you place by the tree's trunk to remind the two of you of what you shared together. Certainly leave a blessing that you give to the tree in closing. Now, I realize for some of us, this is a stretch. Most of us haven't paid much attention to trees other than what use they may have for us. But this may be the start of a whole new relationship. An awareness that there are two very different ways we have of relating to trees. And these two possibilities are expressed so well in two final, very brief stories that I'd like to end with. The first story is one you all know well, Shel Silverstein's The Giving Tree. You remember the apple tree that lives in a little boy's backyard? She loves him dearly, always saying when she sees him, "Come boy, swing in my branches and play." But the boy is always preoccupied, as boys of all ages are prone to be. Over the years, the tree selflessly gives everything she has to the boy, her apples, her limbs, eventually even her trunk, leaving nothing in the end but a stump. And the boy takes everything. The two of them are left at the end as an old man sitting on an old stump, finally resting together. The story is touching, of course, but it's also upsetting in terms of the boy's reckless taking and the tree's endless giving. It says a lot about how we treat the environment in our culture, trees in particular. It says something about how men expect women to always be giving. The tree in the story is a she. And maybe it says something about how we think of friendship, how we imagine we ought to be there utterly for people who need us, how some of us may desperately need to be needed, overwhelmed as a result by codependency. So I love the giving tree story, but I think it needs another story to give it balance. And this is a story I call the useless tree, coming out of the ancient Chinese Taoist tradition. It goes like this. One spring, as peach blossoms filled the valley below with a spray of white fragrance, an ancient sage by the name of Shuangzi wandered the heights of Shang. He noticed a large and extraordinary tree on a hillside where all the other trees had been chopped down. The tree was so huge that the horses drawing 100 chariots could be sheltered under its shade. Amazing that it had never been cut down, he thought. Think of the timber within it. But as he looked up into the branches, he saw that they were all twisted and crooked, going in every direction. None of them were straight enough to be cut into rafters or beams. He broke off a twig and tasted the sap, finding it sharp and bitter. The tree would have been useless for tapping, unable to produce syrup of any worth. And the leaves, as he crumbled them, gave off an offensive odor. They broke too easily to be woven into mats or braided into baskets. They wouldn't even make good mulch. And the roots were so gnarled and rough that you'd never be able to carve a bowl or fashion a fine decorative box out of them. This indeed, said Shuangzi, is a tree good for nothing. That's why it has reached such a great old age. The cinnamon tree can be eaten, and so it is cut down. The varnish tree is useful, and therefore incisions are made in it. We all know the advantage of being useful, but only this tree knows the advantage of being useless. So the Taoist master sat in the shade of that great tree for the rest of the day. As a light wind drifted up from the valley below, he breathed the scent of distant peach blossoms and sat in studied silence, contemplating his own uselessness. He stopped making judgments about the tree's worth, its market value and board foot yield, and sat instead in its welcoming shadow, realizing that his own worth had nothing to do with what he was able to produce. All he needed was to sit in shared silence with an old tree. So how do we, in the end, become more aware of how we use trees on the one hand, and how we might recognize the possibility of their becoming a spiritual teacher for us on the other? How do we learn finally to incorporate both the compassion of the giving tree and the contemplation of the useless tree? May we attend to both, my friends. The future of our planet depends upon it. May it be so. Amen. Aho. Thank you.
You mentioned in your exercise for us to do to bless the tree. I'd like to ask Sister Renita that we could bless each other, especially Belden, with the blessing that we usually use at the end of our meeting. Sister Renita, please.
Thank you. Yes, let us share this blessing of God's presence in all things. Extend our hand in blessing, especially for you, Belden, and sharing this great way that we can learn from our teachers, the trees. So we pray, the Lord bless you and keep you. May God's face shine upon you. May God's goodness and mercy fill you. May God bless you.
Amen.
Amen.
Again, Belden, we thank you, we thank you, we thank you. I don't know if there's enough reaction emojis here to say how wonderful this whole thing was.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. This session has been recorded, and we will make available probably through email the link to the recording so that you can listen to it again. Our next Franciscans for Earth presentation will be September 14th, when we will show the film Kiss the Ground. You register again through our website. As of this moment, it will be online through Zoom that we will show the film. If by September other changes are made that we show the film at the Tau Center, we will let you know. But we would also like to try to somehow continue showing some of our films and events, speakers through Zoom also. So look at our website to find more information about the film Kiss the Ground. I want to thank everybody for being with us this evening. It was wonderful to see so many people and to in relationship with all of you. So thank you, thank you, thank you, and have a wonderful rest of your evening. Bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Sister Cheryl.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cheryl.
You're welcome. Bye, Maurice. Bye, Jack. Bye, Regina.
Bye, Cheryl.
Keep up the great work.
Thank you. I got your email, Maurice.
Oh, good, Cheryl.
How are you all doing in there in Texas?
Hey.
How
We're
are you
doing
all
good.
doing here?
Thank you, Joe. We're doing great.
Good.
We're looking forward to moving to Vermont, though.
Vermont?
Yes.
How about the desert to the forest?
Yes.
Southern border to the northern border. Yeah.
Wow. What will you be doing up there other than enjoying the trees?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, a few more trees up there than down here. We're going to be involved